1906, India. All 14 daughters were named after a single dead sister, the Bhopal Archive. She was born on a humid evening in Bhopal, 1906. The air was heavy with dust and the slow hum of cicadas. A family waited, eager for the cries of a newborn. But the cries that came were weak, thin, trembling, like a candle flame struggling against the wind. Within hours, the first daughter was gone. Her death was quiet, almost unrecorded. Neighbors whispered that the family was cursed. Some said the spirits of the old city had claimed her. Others blamed the illness that swept through Bhopal that summer. No one spoke her name aloud for long. It slipped into silence, buried as quickly as the child herself. But the silence did not end there. It became a shadow that stretched across the household, clinging to every corner, every night of uneasy sleep. In grief, families often move forward, naming their next child something new, something hopeful. But this family did something different, something strange. They gave their next daughter the same name. It was as though the first child had not died, but was meant to be reborn again and again. The name, whispered once with sorrow, was spoken once more with desperate hope. And then again, and again. Every new daughter who followed carried the same name as the one who had died. Imagine the home, a courtyard filled with the chatter of sisters, yet each of them answering to the same word. A single name echoing from every corner of the house. One voice would call, and 14 heads might turn. The name belonged to none of them, and yet it belonged to them all. But beneath this ritual, the first daughter lingered like a ghost. Every repetition of her name was a reminder. Every laugh, every cry, every whispered scolding carried the memory of the one who had never grown up. The family had created a chain, each girl bound to the dead sister they never met. Why did they do it? Some say it was superstition. In Bhopal at the time, death in infancy was common. Naming a child after the lost one was believed to protect the living, a way of tricking fate. Others believed it was guilt, parents unable to let go, forcing every daughter to carry the burden of remembrance. But what happens when grief becomes a tradition? When a single name stretches across 14 lives? The tragedy deepened with every new birth. Neighbors grew unsettled. Children from nearby streets whispered about the house of ghosts, where every daughter bore the same cursed name. Servants moved with unease, glancing at the girls as if they were copies of someone who had never belonged to the world of the living. Inside the home, confusion must have reigned. Imagine a mother calling out, only for every child to pause, unsure of who she met. The sisters lived without individual names, without the right to be remembered as themselves. They were fragments of a story that began with death. And yet, the first daughter, the one who lived for only hours, became more powerful in absence than she ever could have in life. She ruled the family from beyond the grave, shaping the identities of every girl who followed. Her silence spoke louder than their voices. The haunting had no blood, no screams in the night, no ghostly visions. Instead, it was in every introduction, every school roll call, every whispered secret between sisters. A haunting made of repetition. A haunting made of names. And the most chilling truth of all, none of the daughters were truly themselves. They were all shadows of a child who had never survived her first breath. It began with a choice that no one dared question. After the first daughter's short life flickered out, the family seemed to make a vow in secret. They would not bury her completely. They would bring her back again. And again, each time a new child was born, the name returned, like a prayer, like a curse. No one outside the walls of the home fully understood why. But within, the silence was heavy, as though the family had all agreed never to break this ritual. This was not just grief. It was devotion. It was obsession. It was a pact with death itself. Bhopal in 1906 was a city of contrasts. Ornate palaces stood beside crowded markets. The old Mughal traditions coexisted uneasily with British rule, and in the narrow lanes, whispers spread quickly. The family's choice became a subject of gossip. Some called it madness. Others called it devotion to the spirit of the lost child. But no one dared confront them directly. Death was sacred. Mourning was untouchable. Inside the house, however, the silence must have been unbearable. Every daughter grew up knowing she was not her own. She was the continuation of someone who had died. Her identity was not hers to claim. There is a particular cruelty in silence. It eats away at the living more than screams ever could. The girls must have felt it when their mother refused to answer why, when her father looked at them with eyes that seemed to search for someone else, when neighbors avoided saying their names because there was only one name to say. Every meal, every gathering, every prayer at dusk, her name hung in the air like smoke, binding them together in grief. It was not just a memory. It was a chain. Some daughters accepted it. They wore the name like armor, as if it gave them a strange power, the blessing of the firstborn who never lived. But others must have felt it as a wound. To live an entire life knowing you were never truly yourself, to feel erased before you even began. Imagine one of them standing at the threshold of marriage, her name written in ink on the papers. She would not see her own reflection there. She would see the shadow of the first daughter, stamped once more into the world. How do you escape a curse that has been stitched into your very identity? Generations later, the story still lingers in Bhopal's archives. The British gazettes recorded the strange tale, noting it as an oddity, a cultural mystery. But for the family, it was not a curiosity. It was a ritual of survival. Infant mortality haunted the city. Diseases spread in waves. Parents buried children before they could learn to walk. In that world, perhaps the name was not madness, but a desperate shield. If death claimed one child, maybe it would spare the next, if only the name remained the same. It was a gamble with fate, but the cost was enormous. Because a name is not just a word. A name is memory. A name is identity. By giving every daughter the same name, the family had trapped themselves in mourning that never ended. Each birth reopened the wound. Each smile reminded them of the loss. The pact they made with death was silent, but it was binding. No daughter could escape it. No sister could break it. The first child had been buried only once, but her shadow was buried 14 times over. And still, she ruled them all. Names are anchors. They tie us to the world, to our families, to our sense of self. But in Bhopal, in 1906, one name became something else entirely. It became a ritual, a superstition, a binding thread that stretched across 14 daughters. Each time a baby girl was born, the family whispered the same name. They did not choose something new. They did not start fresh. They returned again to the shadow of the first daughter. It was as though they were trying to pull her back, piece by piece, through each child that followed. It was not just memory. It was resurrection by repetition. To outsiders, the practice seemed unsettling. Yet across India at the time, death in childhood was a familiar grief. In many families, if a child died, the next might inherit the same name. It was a way of defying fate, a way of saying, you may take one, but you will not erase them from our lives. But in this case, the tradition spiraled beyond reason. Not once, not twice, 14 times. With every repetition, the weight grew heavier. The first daughter's name no longer belonged to her. It became something larger, an identity that swallowed every sister whole. Inside the family, this must have created strange tensions. Did the girls compete quietly for individuality? Did they long to be seen, not as echoes, but as themselves? Or did they surrender to the idea that they were fragments of one story, one grief that none of them had chosen? Imagine them in school, sitting in rows, each one responding to the same roll call. Teachers baffled, classmates whispering. The name that once marked the loss of one child now erased the identities of many. Every repetition was meant to protect them, yet every repetition erased them further. The family's neighbors believed something darker was at play. Some said the house was cursed. Others whispered that the parents were bargaining with spirits, that they had bound themselves to an unspoken vow, promising to keep the first daughter alive through the living. For the daughters, childhood must have been a strange blur. To be called by the same name as your sister, to have your parents look at you but never quite see you, must have been haunting. Their laughter in the courtyard, their whispers before sleep, all carried the ghost of someone else. Even in play, the first daughter was always present. She was the sister they never knew, yet could never escape. There is something chilling in the persistence of repetition, like footsteps in an empty hallway, like a single candle relit every night. The act of naming became a ritual of mourning, one that could never end. The tradition was no longer about honoring the dead. It had become about binding the living. The daughters were forced to carry the silence, the grief, the superstition that had been born before they ever drew their first breath. And through it all, the first daughter's presence grew stronger, not weaker. The more they repeated her name, the more she seemed to control the house. She had no body, no face, no voice. But she had power, a power none of her sisters could escape. By the time the third, fourth, and fifth daughters arrived, the story of the household had already spread beyond its walls. In the crowded bazaars of Bhopal, between the spice stalls and the cloth merchants, people whispered about the family with the strange daughters. Every child had the same name. Every birth seemed to reopen an old wound. To outsiders, it felt unnatural, something that smelled faintly of curses and unfinished business. Bhopal was a city of echoes. The marble palaces of the Nawabs, the narrow alleys of old quarters, the haunting lakes that mirrored the moon at night, all seemed to hold secrets. But none were as unsettling as the story told in hushed tones. There's a house where the dead child lives still. 14 times over, she has been born again. Children in the neighborhood played games of superstition. They dared one another to walk past the family's courtyard after dark. They whispered that if you called the name aloud 3 times, the ghost of the first daughter would appear at the window. In truth, no ghost ever came. But the silence of the house was haunting enough. Inside, life carried on. The sisters grew, played, and quarreled like children everywhere. Yet their shared name became both a bond and a curse. When their mother called out, a chorus of voices answered. Confusion was constant, but so was a strange unity. It was as if the family had created a single daughter, multiplied 14 times. Still, behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Each girl must have longed to be recognized as herself. A look in her father's eyes that said, I see you, not the one who died. A moment when her name was hers alone. But that moment never came. The courtyard itself became a stage for whispers. Neighbors passing by would hear the name repeated again and again, shouted during games, called out in laughter, spoken in anger. To them, it sounded like the echo of a spirit haunting her own home. Stories grew wilder with each retelling. Some said the first daughter had not truly died, that she wandered unseen, watching over her sisters. Others swore the family was cursed, doomed to lose the girls unless they bore the same name. The truth was more tragic. The name was not a shield. It was a wound that never closed. By the time the British officers heard of it, they were fascinated. Colonial administrators often collected oddities, strange customs, superstitions, and scandals that colored their reports back home. The Bhopal daughters became a subject of quiet record, their story tucked into gazettes and reports like a curiosity from a distant land. But for the family, it was not curiosity. It was survival. It was grief made flesh. And for the daughters, it was a life lived in echoes. At night, when the lamps were put out and the house fell silent, each girl must have wondered, am I myself? Or am I only her? The whispers in the courtyard did not fade with the day. They seeped into their dreams, into their futures, into the way they were remembered. Because in Bhopal, in 1906, there was never just one daughter. There were 14 daughters, and only one name. They were born into a life already written for them. Each girl arrived in the world carrying the same word, the same fragile identity that belonged to someone who had never lived past her first breath. From the moment they cried out in the delivery room, they were not themselves. They were her, the ghost sister. As children, they must have felt the strangeness almost immediately. In the courtyard, when their mother called, Every sister froze, waiting for her gaze to decide which one she meant. In school, their teachers stumbled, confused by records that listed girl after girl under the same name. In the marketplace, neighbors shook their heads, unsure of how to address them. To outsiders, it was a curiosity. To the sisters, it was a cage. A name is the first gift a child receives. It shapes who they are. But for these daughters, it was never theirs to own. It was borrowed. It was haunted. Imagine their childhood conversations. One might whisper to another before sleep, "Do you think we're different people? Or are we all just her?" The younger ones may not have even known the story at first. They may have thought it normal until whispers from neighbors or the stares of schoolmates revealed the truth. Slowly, the weight of it must have sunk in, that none of them were free. Each girl grew older beneath the same shadow. Each one carried the burden of being both alive and not alive, both herself and someone else. But human hearts are stubborn. Some of the daughters must have fought to carve out identities beyond the ghost. One may have painted her brushstrokes trying to sign a name that was not her own. Another may have learned poetry, pouring words onto paper to speak with a voice uniquely hers. A third might have rebelled, breaking rules and defying her parents, if only to prove she was not just a shadow. And yet, no matter how far they tried to run, the name followed. It clung to them like a second skin. What does it do to a family when individuality is erased? The daughters became a strange kind of mirror. When one failed, the others felt the weight. When one succeeded, her glory was not hers alone. Achievements blurred, mistakes blurred, joys blurred. They were not daughters living side by side. They were pieces of the same broken reflection. Even marriage could not free them. Each wedding carried the ghost's name into a new home, a new family line. Each husband married not just a wife, but the echo of the first daughter, the one who had died before her story began. The cruelest truth was this: none of the 14 could truly answer the simplest question: who am I? They wore the clothes of the living, but the name of the dead. They played, they worked, they prayed, but in every act, they carried the ghost with them. Their lives were never their own. They grew up not as individuals, but as echoes. And an echo, no matter how loud, always belongs to something that has already passed. Behind a family's choice lay more than grief. It was a strange tangle of superstition and guilt, woven tightly into the silence of their home. In 1906 India, death in infancy was common. Parents buried tiny coffins in hurried prayers, often without even marking the grave. But this family refused to let go. They believed, perhaps desperately, that repeating the name was a shield. If death came once, maybe it could be tricked. Maybe the spirit will be satisfied with its first victim and spare the rest. But superstition has sharp edges. What was meant to protect, instead became a curse. The weight of memory was everywhere. The first daughter's name was carved into school rosters, temple lists, even British records, each time under a new child. Her ghost followed the ink, stamped across history with mechanical precision. For the parents, it was not madness but devotion. Each new daughter was not just a child, they were a second chance. A living prayer whispered into existence. And yet, guilt lingered. Had they failed the first daughter? Was this their punishment? Each repetition of the name seemed to whisper back, yes. The sisters carried that burden unknowingly. When they laughed in the courtyard, the sound was always followed by silence, as if the adults in the house remembered someone else who should have been laughing too. When they cried, the tears were heavier because they were never just their own. And the guilt was not only the parents. It seeped into the daughters themselves. The older ones must have wondered, why do I carry her name? Why not someone else? The younger ones must have thought, am I real? Or am I just her again? The weight of memory pressed down like the humid air of a Bhopal summer. Thick, unrelenting, impossible to breathe through. Outside, the neighbors fed the story. They said the family had angered the gods, that the spirit of the first daughter demanded worship. Others whispered that the parents were cursed, doomed to bury daughters until the debt of their sins was paid. Children dared one another to peer through the family's gate, where the sisters played. To them, the girls looked less like children and more like reflections of a single ghost, repeating over and over. Superstition turned the house into a spectacle, but inside, the girls bore the heaviest burden. There's a cruelty in being forced to live as memory instead of possibility. Each daughter could not be fully herself, because she had to be the ghost too. She was not free to define her life. Her path had been traced before she even opened her eyes. And yet they carried it, because children do not choose the names they bear. The parents may have believed they were saving their daughters, but what they had really done was trap them in a cycle of grief, superstition, and guilt, a cycle that could never be broken. The first daughter had died once, but her shadow was killing the others slowly, every single day. The whispers of the city did not stay in the courtyards. They drifted into official ears, clerks, record keepers, colonial officers who collected stories as though they were artifacts. In the early 1900s, the British administration in India recorded not only taxes and trade, but also strange customs and unusual happenings. And so, buried deep within the brittle pages of the Bhopal Gazettes, the story of the 14 daughters appeared. The British did not write of it with sorrow. They wrote of it with curiosity, like men cataloging the habits of a foreign land. To them, it was not tragedy. It was spectacle. One entry noted the family's peculiar devotion, calling it a native superstition. Another hinted at madness, painting the parents as desperate people lost in grief. None of the records spoke of the daughters as individuals. They were listed as numbers. Statistics, curiosities. Would have been unbearable sorrow for one family became a line in a colonial report. But history is built on such lines. Without them, the story might have been lost completely. Without the British fixation on recording, the 14 daughters might have slipped into rumor, their lives reduced to whispers fading in the bazaars. Instead, the gazettes preserved their ghost. Ink on paper made their haunting permanent. Imagine a clerk in 1906, sitting under the heavy ceiling fans of a colonial office, his pen scratching across paper as he copied the names. The room smelled of dust and old wood. Outside, the sun beat down on the streets of Bhopal, and inside, with each stroke of the pen, he sealed the daughters into history, not as children, but as a mystery to be studied. Their tragedy became a curiosity to men who had never known them. The coldness of those reports is haunting. There is no mention of the sisters' laughter in the courtyard, no description of their confusion at sharing the same name, no record of their tears. The British did not care for the human element. They cared for the strangeness. To them, the daughters were not victims of grief or superstition or love. They were an oddity to be written down, archived, and forgotten on a shelf. And yet, in that forgetting, they were remembered. The gazettes remain, fragile pages stored away in archives, waiting for someone to stumble upon the story again. And when they do, the same question rises from the ink. Why would a family name all 14 daughters after the one who died? It is a question that has no clear answer, only shadows. But it is a question that keeps the daughters alive. Because as long as someone is asking, the ghost still lingers. At first, the repetition of the name may have felt like protection, a fragile hope against fate. But as the years passed, the daughters themselves began to feel the curse in ways their parents never imagined. A name is meant to set you apart. Instead, there's bound them together too tightly, strangling their individuality. Every mistake one made stained them all. Every failure echoed across the sisters, because it carried the same word, the same identity. The name no longer shielded them. It consumed them. In Bhopal streets, people began to look at them differently. When the sisters walked together, they were not seen as 14 individuals, but as a single ghost multiplied. Vendors in the market shook their heads, muttering that the family had chained itself to death. Children teased them, calling them the living dead. The daughters could not answer back, not with a name of their own. Even inside the household, the curse deepened. Birthdays blurred, gifts repeated, Their mother must have struggled to separate one child from another, their father seeing fragments of the first daughter in every face. Affection became complicated, tangled in guilt and memory. Every smile was shadowed by loss. And for the daughters, love itself must have been haunted. When suitors came, what did they see? A girl of flesh and spirit, or the lingering ghost who had died too soon. Marriage contracts carried the same name over and over, passed into new homes like an heirloom that no one wanted but no one could refuse. Even husbands must have wondered if they had married a woman or a memory. The curse did not end at childhood. It followed the sisters into adulthood, into motherhood, into the way their children were named. By then, the name was no longer just a word. It was a story told again and again, stamped onto lives without consent. Each daughter carried it not as a blessing, but as a burden. They were not individuals. They were vessels for a ghost. What began as an act of love had twisted into a chain. And the cruelest part was this. No matter how far they went, the daughters could never run from it. The name was written in ink on every document, spoken on every street corner, whispered in every memory. It was a curse they carried in every breath. Some of them may have dreamed of renaming themselves, of breaking the cycle, of choosing a new word, one that belonged to no one but them. But names are not easily shed, especially not in Bhopal, where family honor and tradition held tighter than chains. So they lived with it, year after year. The first daughter's shadow pressed harder. The ghost grew stronger, not weaker. Because when you repeat something long enough, it does not fade. It becomes eternal. By the time the 14th daughter was born, the story had become a ritual carved deep into the family's bones. Neighbors no longer gasped in shock when they heard the name repeated. They shook their heads instead, murmuring prayers under their breath, as if the family's curse had stretched beyond reason. The 14th child entered a world already drenched in sorrow and superstition. Unlike the sisters before her, she carried not only the ghost's name, but also the full weight of every repetition that came before. She was the last link in a chain that had been hammered into place for decades. Imagine her childhood. By then, the older sisters had grown, some married, some moved away. Yet in every corner of her life, the name lingered. It was no longer just a haunting. It was a legend, a burden spoken of across the city. The 14th daughter must have felt it pressing down harder than ever. She was not just another vessel of the first child's memory. She was the culmination of it. The ghost did not merely walk beside her. Did they believe she would live not just for herself, but for all the sisters before her? That expectation is a heavy thing to place on any child. The 14th daughter grew up not only with a ghost's name, but with the crushing responsibility of carrying the story forward. Her life was never hers to shape. It was an inheritance of sorrow. And yet, there is a strange resilience in such children. Perhaps she tried harder than any of her sisters to carve out an identity of her own. Maybe she rebelled against the silence, spoke louder, demanded to be seen. Or maybe she retreated inward, drowning in the weight of being both herself and the echo of 13 sisters before her. The truth may never be known. The records do not tell us her heart. They only tell us her name. The same name. Always the same name. What we do know is this. The 14th daughter marked the end of the story. After her, there were no more sisters to carry the ghost's name. The chain ended with her. But ending is not the same as escape. For the ghost still lived in her identity, in the gazettes that documented her, in the whispers of Bhopal's courtyards. She bore the heaviest weight, not because she was the last, but because she carried them all. 14 lives. One name. One haunting. The 14th daughter was not remembered for who she was. She was remembered for being the final vessel of a child who never lived. Her story was not her own. It was the ghost's story, whispered for the last time. Time has a way of swallowing stories whole. Families scatter, houses crumble, voices fade. What remains is paper, fragile, yellowed, tucked away in archives where few ever look. That is where the story of the 14 daughters lies today, not in memory, but in brittle records that smell of dust and age. The British gazettes, written with cold detachment, carried the names forward. After independence, the records slipped into obscurity, buried in stacks of forgotten files. But history has a strange persistence. Even when ignored, it waits. And when uncovered, it haunts. The archive speaks in fragments. A line here, a note there. Mentions of the same name, repeated over years, attached to different daughters. There are no details of their laughter, no words describing the weight they carried. Just statistics, just repetition. But between those lines, silence speaks. The silence of a family who could not let go. The silence of daughters who live their entire lives under someone else's shadow. That silence is louder than words. Modern historians stumble upon the tale and pause. How could such a story exist? 14 children bearing one name, all in memory of a child who never grew. It reads like myth, like ghost story. But the archive insists it happened. And so, the story lives again, not in the voices of the daughters, but in ours. In every retelling, in every whisper of a name, the ghost rises. The sisters, long gone, are remembered not for who they were, but for what they carried. Their lives blur into one. There is tragedy in forgetting, but there is tragedy in remembering too. To speak of them now is to realize how little of them remains. No portraits, no diaries, no words of their own. Only the archive and a haunting echo of one name. And yet, perhaps that is the cruel beauty of it, because in being forgotten, they became eternal. The ghost story did not die in 1906. It breathes even now, a century later, through anyone who hears it and wonders. The archive does not give us answers. It does not explain why the parents did it, or how the daughters lived, or whether they ever found peace. It only leaves us with questions. Why did grief become obsession? Why did remembrance become curse? Why did one child's short life become the weight of 14? The archive cannot tell us. It only leaves us with echoes. But maybe echoes are enough, because echoes do not vanish. They linger. They haunt. They demand that we listen, even when the voice itself is gone. And so, more than 100 years later, the story of the 14 daughters still whispers from the shadows of Bhopal. Not as history, but as haunting. They demand that we listen, even when the voice itself is gone. And so, more than 100 years later, the story of the 14 daughters still whispers from the shadows of Bhopal. Not as history, but as haunting.